Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
I can't sleep. Everything feels flat and grey. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. Subject to forthcoming clinical trial results, we will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved. So that's the video, and we'd love you to share it. And now we're just going to show you some introductory slides before Peter takes over. Or how do you share it? We're being asked questions on the chat screen about how to share it. So we'll pop the link in there. Ilan, is Erin monitoring the chat?
Yes, she is.
Okay, fantastic.
And we'll also email out the link tomorrow.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you. So we'll just go to the next slide, Ilan, please. So one important thing just to mention is we don't encourage or facilitate use of psychedelics in a recreational setting. Are focused on the medical and legal use of these substances. We will be recording this webinar, and we do publish this on YouTube and our platforms and share them and so on. Next slide. So we have this mental health crisis, this epidemic that is really going through the roof now. Obviously, particularly in Victoria, there's been a poll done just in the last few days, which shows that 50%, according to this poll anyway, 50% of people in Victoria are now experiencing a mental illness due to the lockdowns and crisis, which is tragic and very sad because, as we all know, it's very hard to cure a mental illness effectively at the moment with traditional treatments. So the statistics pre-COVID, 1 in 5 Australian adults had a chronic mental illness, 1 in 2 will experience one in their lifetimes, 1 in 8 Australians now on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians and children as young as 5 being given antidepressants. We'll move to the next slide now. And unfortunately, the treatment outcomes remain inadequate. There's been no innovation in treatment for the past 50 years. And only 35% of sufferers experience remission from either pharmacotherapy, which is primarily antidepressants, or psychotherapy. Most patients relapse or then have to change their medications, and there's many side effects to these sorts of medications, nasty side effects. Post-traumatic stress disorder is even harder to treat, and the remission rates are even lower. So more of the same is not going to solve the problem. Next slide. We're a registered charity, DGR1 status. Peter and I are both social entrepreneurs and philanthropists, so we donate not only our money, but we donate our time to this charity. Each of us donates about 60 to 70 hours a week towards this work. And we've set up 4 previous charities between us. And we're very, very committed to social change. Our primary focus with this charity is to make sure that there's improved treatment outcomes and options for practitioners and their patients. And at the moment, we're focused on psilocybin and MDMA because they're in the later stages of FDA and approvals around the world, but we are interested in other medicines as well. Success is that these therapies become an integrated part of our mental health system, so that if you go to a doctor and you have some type of mental illness, or you think you do, that you'll be given an option of different types of treatments, antidepressants or other medications, psychotherapy, and also psychedelic-assisted therapy as options, with full disclosure on the benefits and drawbacks of each kind of treatment. The medicines have high remission rates, leading to substantial improvement, and we hope that those remission rates will be replicated through all the work that's done to make sure that these medicines are delivered in the most effective environments for Australians. And our goal is that they are accessible and affordable to all Australians in need, no matter where they're based or...
Oh, shit.
Hello? Sorry, someone just swore. Is that you, Ilhan? Next slide, please. Thank you. So psilocybin's being used for depression and possibly obsessive compulsive disorder and addiction, MDMA for PTSD and possibly a treatment of addiction. The wonderful thing about these medicines, for those that don't know that much about them, is that they only require 2 to 3 dose sessions in combination with psychotherapy. And this is in contrast to conventional treatments where patients are often on antidepressants or other psychiatric medications or in therapy for their whole lives and suffering. The medicines are considered extremely safe in a medically controlled environment, and they're non-addictive. They're a curative medicine as opposed to a palliative medicine. So palliative medicines, the existing medicines, mainly manage the symptoms, but these medicines actually create healing so that mental health doesn't have to be a life sentence. As I mentioned earlier, both...
Mental illness.
Sorry, mental illness doesn't have to be a life sentence. Both have been granted breakthrough therapy status, which is given to fast-track the approval process, and this is only granted to medicines that have vastly superior outcomes to existing treatments. Next slide. The 4 key strategic areas of our strategy, our goal is to build the ecosystem for these medicines here and to make sure that they become available as soon as possible to those who need them. So one of those strategies is around education and events, awareness and knowledge building. So events like tonight, webinars, educating doctors, lawyers, MPs, everyone we can. Major International Medical Summit in November 2021, postponed to then because of COVID. We also have state and regional chapters. So we have over 25 chapters, Australia and a number in New Zealand as well. We've also launched recently a professional development program, which is a certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies for psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, GPs, social workers, mental health nurses, drug and addiction specialists, occupational therapists and others, to make sure that they can work with these medicines and these treatments and deliver them in the best way possible to get the best outcomes for the patients. And I'm pleased to say that we've had so many applications that we only have a handful of places left in our first intake, and also even our second intake is also going very well. We're also looking at setting up an Asia Pacific Centre for Emerging Mental Health Therapies, applied research and development, looking at manufacturing and growing these medicines here in Australia, looking at economic modelling, and we're also looking at, that's very odd, that audio has just gone funny, sorry about that everyone, preferred legal and ethical frameworks. So we'll talk a lot about that in this session, and we'll also talk about our psychological support services during this session. So yeah, with that, I think we'll move to the next slide. And Peter is going to take over from here. Okay. So welcome, Peter.
Okay, well, hello everyone. This is where the rubber really does hit the road, because, you know, we can all believe that these therapies are worthwhile therapies and can make a big indent on our mental health system. But to do that, we need a legal system that recognises that these medicines are medicines and provides, with appropriate controls, appropriate access to these medicines for doctors and their patients. So tonight's all about assessing the current system and how far it is from that ideal system, but also to look at the ways that the system is now starting to change and adjust, and our ambitions for the future. So next slide. All right, now, I mean, you all know the history of psychedelic therapy, psychedelic medicines. They've been with us, as Tanya says, since ancient times, and they've been with us as medicines. In terms of MDMA, MDMA is a pharmaceutical chemical, so it's not a classic psychedelic. It was invented for the first time in 1912, synthesized or put together by a pharmaceutical company. 1938, we have the first synthesis of LSD by a pharmaceutical company, and then subsequently the first synthesis of psilocybin. And bear in mind, for medical use, the tendency is to use synthesized versions of plant-based medicines, because that's a way that you can satisfy the regulator in relation to standardization of that particular medicine. 50s and 60s, we have this amazing period where psychiatrists start to see these substances as a new way for psychiatry to take place. And over 40,000 people patients going through those therapies. Then we have the war on drugs, which I'll talk a bit about, in 1970. And then we have a renaissance in the late 1990s, which has gone through to today. The latest bit of news, and there's growing momentum in this area, is Health Canada approving psychedelic-assisted therapy using psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety and distress for 4 individuals with a terminal diagnosis. So we see continuing momentum in this sector. Next slide. Okay, I talked briefly about the war on drugs, but as we're going to see, we are still living with the repercussions of what Nixon did back in 1970. The war on drugs had nothing to do with the underlying essence of these psychedelics. It was all about Nixon cynically wanting to imprison the leaders of the anti-war movement and other people who were disrupting America, in his view, were disrupting America in the late 1960s. MDMA wasn't criminalized at the time, but it subsequently became criminalized in the mid-1980s. And that criminalization led to a real drying up of research funding, which meant that there was actually very little done with psychedelic medicine right until research started again in the late 1990s. Next one. Okay, this slide just really highlights what I've just said, that you had this massive increase in research into these substances as medicines through to about 1970. You then have the drying up of research until the late 1990s. And now what we're seeing is this renaissance, which keeps accelerating. Over 120 current or recently completed trials. Next slide. All right, so that's the background, but let's just look at what happened with Nixon's war on drugs. There were 3 UN conventions that relate to drugs and cause all the problems that we're seeing with in the criminal area with drugs today. the key one we're focused on as far as these medicines is concerned is the Convention on Psychotropic Substances of 1971, because they included LSD and psilocybin and later MDMA as Schedule 1 drugs. And Schedule 1 drugs from the UN's perspective and from member states' perspective, including Australia, were the worst types of drugs, and therefore they needed to be prohibited and dealt with in the severest way. Having said all that, the UN Convention actually contained an exemption, and it's worth just focusing on the wording of that convention. And I've got the wording at the bottom of the slide, because what that wording says is that despite the fact that these drugs should be prohibited, there was an exemption for scientific research and, in quotes, very limited medical purposes by duly authorized persons. And it's that medical exemption which we're seeing the TGA using at the federal level with the special access scheme. Next slide, Ilan. All right, so what I want to do now is paint the picture of the Australian legal system. And because we're a federation, we've got to look at the legal system at both the federal level and at the state level. At the federal level, that convention of 1971 has led to three major impacts. The first one is the impact on the poison standard. Now, for those who don't know what the poison standard is, it's a way of categorizing different substances from a medical perspective in terms of risk to consumers. So I've highlighted there the major schedules that affect the medicinal use of substances. And they go from the weakest, which is pharmacy medicine, where you go in and you buy some cough mixture, through to pharmacy-only medicine. You only get it by asking the pharmacist, and he or she makes an assessment of whether it's appropriate for you. Through to prescription medicine, where you go to a doctor and he writes out a prescription for you for statins or whatever you've asked for. Through to controlled medicines like morphine and cannabis, medical cannabis, which are seen as being medicines but higher risk and therefore needing higher controls, through to Schedule 9, which are prohibited substances, not really seen as having any medical value. And unfortunately, because of that convention of 1971 and the fact that psilocybin and MDMA were targeted in that UN convention, MDMA and psilocybin have been slotted into Schedule 9, prohibited substances. Now, the way the poison standard works is that it's actually given legislative effect by states around Australia. And that's where we're going to find the problem, not at the federal level, but at the state level. And I'll come on to that. I should say that one of the things I'm going to talk about a bit later on is the fact that Mind Medicine Australia has lodged an application for the rescheduling of psilocybin and MDMA from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8. And as you'll see in this presentation, if we're successful, a lot of the legal constraints actually get removed. So it's a really important application, and we'd love all of you to put in submissions in support. Next slide. Okay, so the first impact is the fact that we're Schedule 9 substances, and that has all sorts of problems in terms of using them at the state level for medical purposes. The second major impact, though, is that what the TGA have done is they've utilised that exemption that we saw in the convention to enable doctors to apply for Schedule 9 substances on a case-by-case basis through the special access scheme. Now, the beauty of the special access scheme is that the medicines don't have to be listed on the TGA register. All medicines, or most medicines where they're going to be used at scale, the sponsor will want them to be on the register, because by being on the register, it enables doctors to authorize the use of that medicine without having to go back to the TGA every time. But in our case, psilocybin and MDMA aren't on the register, and therefore the only way that we can use it in Australia is through the special access scheme. The good news here is that we've already had a number of applications being made by psychiatrists for the use of these medicines. And on each occasion that applications have been made, the TGA has given approval for the use of the therapy within a matter of days. So it's been a really efficient turnaround time from the TGA, and that part of the system is working very well. In order to get SASB approval, what the medical practitioner has to do is provide material to the TGA justifying the use of the scheme. And to do that, they need to provide material about the safety and the efficacy of the medicines. And there we've helped them put that together. They also need to provide information about the patient and detail the fact that other treatments have failed. So this course is really for patients who are treatment resistant to suffering from treatment-resistant depression or treatment-resistant PTSD. The next slide. Okay, the third impact at the federal level is tighter controls through the Office of Drug Control. Now, we don't produce medical-grade psilocybin or MDMA in Australia, so if we're going to use these medicines, we've got to import them from overseas. Now, on that aspect, the good news is that My Medicine Australia has sourced medical-grade psilocybin and medical-grade MDMA, which should satisfy the TGA from a producer in North America. So that's the good news. The more challenging news is that in order to bring it into the country, we have to get an import permit from the Office of Drug Control. And they will only give us an import permit if we get a permit from the state government in which the medicine is to be used. So again, at the federal level, it's all fine. Where we start getting into murky waters is when we get into the state level. So next. All right, so let's talk about the state level. And that's where Australia gets very messy. And it's because every state is different. Every state has different legislation and different barriers. Some straightforward, some more complicated. Starting with New South Wales. In New South Wales, they didn't read that exemption in the UN Convention when they legislated, because they actually didn't put into the legislation a medical exemption. They basically said that if you're a Schedule 9 substance and you're listed as Schedule 1 on the Drugs Misuse and Trafficking Act, which is the act that makes the possession of these drugs criminal, if you're listed on that in Schedule 1, there is no way that you can actually access these medicines as medicines unless either you change the legislation or you do it as part of a trial. Now, what we're doing about that is we're making representations now to the New South Wales government to explain to them why the legislation, frankly, is stupid in terms of the medical use of these substances and why it goes further than they needed to go in terms of the UN Convention. We're also looking at whether we can structure an observational trial, which would enable psychiatrists to also access the medicine with the authorisation of the New South Wales government. So that's New South Wales. Challenging, but there is a way through. Victoria, on the other hand, is much more straightforward. In Victoria, they did actually read the exemption in the UN Convention. And all you need to do in Victoria, once you have that SASB approval from the federal government or from the TGA, is apply for a permit at the state level. So that's a relatively straightforward process. So for any psychiatrists in the audience who have patients who are based in Victoria with patients in Victoria, you can access these medicines by getting SASB approval from the TGA, which we know is possible, and by getting a permit from the Victorian government. Next slide. Queensland is a bit like New South Wales. There's a barrier. And again, we're going to have to work with the Queensland government to explain to them why they need to have an exemption for the medical use of these medicines. And in other states and territories, we're reviewing them at the moment. We know there are barriers in Tasmania and Western Australia. we also know, which is good news, that the Greens, which form part of the government in the ACT, are putting the legalisation of medical use of psychedelics as part of their manifesto for the next election. So at the political level, things are starting to open up. Overall summary then of all of that is that good news at the federal level, at the state level more complicated, and what we're doing as an organisation is making sure that we explain the problems to state governments and we encourage them where necessary to change their legislation. We're also looking at trials as a way through, and we've also got a permit system in Victoria, which makes it much more straightforward if you happen to be based in Victoria, although perhaps not at the current time given the lockdown in Victoria. Next slide, please. All right, I said earlier on that it's really important that we get this application to reschedule from 9 to 8 through. And the reason it's so important is that if we get it through, a lot of these barriers at the state level fade away. You know, the barriers are there because these are Schedule 9 substances. Once they're Schedule 8 substances, it becomes much easier to get the requisite approvals at the state government level. So it's extremely important that we get this application through the TGA for rescheduling. Next slide, please. All right, so what is the timetable for the rescheduling application? Well, we put it in at the start of July. We're now in an open submission period where members of the public can comment on our applications. You can access the applications by just going onto our website. We're an open source organisation. On our website also is a how-to guide. It's a very simple guide about how you actually make a public submission. And these public submissions only need to be like 1.5, 2 pages long. But if you have an interest in this area, and you clearly do by being part of this webinar, look on our website, look at the how-to guide, and please put in submissions of support. And that's particularly if you come from a medical or scientific background. Because rightly or wrongly, the views of medical practitioners and scientists and researchers are going to be taken more seriously than people without scientific knowledge of these medicines. So say that submission period ends on the 28th of September. There is then an advisory panel meeting for the TGA in early November, and an interim decision is made on whether to reschedule these medicines. That is then announced in early February. And then there's a second submission period. But the only people who can lodge submissions in the second period are those who put in submissions in the first period. So don't wait for the second period to put in a submission, because you won't be able to unless you go into the current period. There's then a final decision made in April, and the decision becomes effective from early June. So it's quite a long process, but an incredibly important process, as we'll see as we go further into this presentation. Next slide, Elaine. Okay, so why is rescheduling so important? First thing I should say is we're talking about moving these medicines from Schedule 9 prohibited substances to Schedule 8 controlled substances. And the controls that we've suggested to the TGA are these: that these therapies can only be prescribed by psychiatrists or specialist addiction physicians. And secondly, that they have to take place in medically controlled environments. And a lot of us will look at those constraints and say, well, do they need to be that tight? And my answer would be, they need to be that tight to maximize our chances of getting this rescheduling through. I've had some people say to me, well, we should have gone for Schedule 4, which is prescription medicine, which any doctor can prescribe. I can tell you, had we tried to do that, our chances of being successful would have been minimal. We're far better off going for Schedule 8 and having these acknowledged as medicines, and then looking for any further rescheduling down the track if it's appropriate. Okay, so why is rescheduling to Schedule 8 so important? Well, 3 reasons. Firstly, those state barriers start to fade away. It becomes much easier to get those state permits. And that ease of access in places like New South Wales means that these medicines then, or these therapies then become available in those states. Don't need that at the current time in Victoria, but even in Victoria, if it's Schedule 8 rather than Schedule 9, the process will be a lot easier. Next slide, Ilan. Okay, the second reason that it's so important to reschedule these medicines is because we want to educate Australians that actually they have nothing to fear about the medical use of these medicines, that they can be used sensibly, and by using them sensibly, they can actually provide the medical fraternity with a new treatment option, which is showing fabulous remission rates in overseas trials. And as part of that education, we can then look to reducing significantly those terrible mental health statistics that we have in Australia. So education is a really important part of this, because education is not just the education of the psychiatrists and the doctors, it's also education of the prospective patients that these medicines are safe. Next slide, Ilan. The third reason, and I suspect it's a reason dear to many people's hearts on this webinar, is to remove this ridiculous stigma that's associated with the use of these substances as medicines. You know, we have a stigma because a corrupt president in 1970 decided to outlaw these medicines for reasons that had nothing to do with the science. And unfortunately, what's happened in Australia is because it's been on the statute books for so long, people have assumed that the law must be there for a good reason, for a rational reason. And again, by rescheduling these medicines from 9 to 8, we demonstrate in the most obvious way that they can be used as medicines and that they don't deserve the stigma that so many people associate with these medicines. Next slide, please, Ilan. All right, now in terms of making a submission, and I hope a lot of you who are watching this webinar are now keen to lodge one. It's incredibly simple. You go onto our website, you download a copy of our rescheduling guide. It's a how-to guide, and it will take you step by step through the process of lodging a submission. The key thing with a submission is it has to be your submission, your views. And a recommendation is to make it as short as possible. You know, if it's a 10-page submission, I'll guarantee you that people receiving that submission will struggle to get to the last page. If it's 2 pages and it's written in a really focused way, we maximize its relevance and the chances of it being read properly. So don't go into a long dissertation about subjective views about these medicines. Keep it tight. If you suffer mental illness, talk about the importance of expanding the treatment paradigm. If you've got a medical background, talk about the fact that you've looked at our applications, you've looked at the science, and you believe these are medicines and they need to be rescheduled. Okay, next slide, please, Ilan. Okay, now we're moving on to Alana's area, and there'll be time at the end for any questions that you have on the legal, the legal perspective or the legal system as it applies to these medicines. But the point I want to leave with you all is that there is light at the end of the tunnel. These medicines now can be accessed in Victoria by psychiatrists, stroke medical specialists for patients in Victoria. There may be a way through with a trial in New South Wales for the same to take place. And if we can change the listing or the scheduling of these medicines from 9 to 8, most of the state barriers will just fade away, and the permits that doctors need to be able to use these medicines will be obtainable. So this rescheduling, I can't overemphasize how important it is for all of us to get behind it. So Alana, that's over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us as we make history together, and we're all needed. Any contribution, big and small, is needed. So my name's Dr. Alana Roy. I'm a social worker and psychologist and the practice manager of My Medicine Psychological Services, and also on the steering committee of the certificate in psychedelic therapies. So we set up the psychological services team to provide a really professional and ethical service of highly qualified mental health practitioners who have experiences understanding the medicines, psychedelics and plant medicines, as well as extensive experience across a whole range of therapies. We have psychologists, GPs, psychotherapists, and counsellors on our team, and we are always looking to expand. So please make contact with me. And we are also expanding to include integrative health professionals who have experience with these medicines as well. Our goal is the clinical legal pathway. We do not encourage or facilitate illegal use. However, a large part of our service is providing integration support. So that might be for people who have used these medicines legally overseas or who are using them in the community. And although our focus is the clinical pathway, as Peter's been talking about, anyone is welcome to make contact with us if they're needing harm minimisation support, therapy, any education around how to keep safe as they have these experiences. And our team also focuses on not only MDMA and psilocybin, but a whole range of plant medicines, iboga, ayahuasca, DMT, and wachuma. And yep, next slide, Ellen. Okay. So what do we offer? We offer SASB eligibility consultations. So lots of people make contact with me and our team about beginning that first step into seeing if they are eligible to go down this pathway. Do they have the correct diagnosis, depression for psilocybin and PTSD, MDMA? And do they have the right paperwork, the right evidence? And we can support you and guide you through that process. We can also refer you to specialists within our team, but also externally. So it is looking at the best options for you. And as we do that, we are building, a national team of professionals who are interested in working in this space and building a community so that we can make this happen together and stay connected and provide the best services possible. We do individual assessment, diagnosis and counselling. So lots of people have contacted us, even if they're not ready to engage in the SASB process, they might just want to talk to a therapist who has a wider a framework to work with. So, our team are trained not only in scientific perspectives, but also esoteric, shamanic, spiritual, a whole range of modalities. So, and many people are finding great benefit in this new paradigm of mental health and the therapists that are able to work and connect on these levels. We provide group integration on Zoom. So if anyone's needing support out there in the community, particularly during COVID, and if you're feeling cut off and isolated, we have Zoom every 3 weeks where we can get together and talk about our experiences, as well as peer supervisions for professionals who are working in this space and needing clinical support with their clients. We offer professional consultations, training, supervision. That's individual supervision across multiple disciplines, but we have major partnerships with universities in Australia and take on students across many different modalities. So please make contact with us if you are looking to do a placement in the near future, and we'll see how we can help. We do lots of community education and advocacy. A large part of my social work and working with universities is getting this message out all around the student bodies and academia. We see people through mental health care plans via GPs, and some of us have capacity to bulk bill people who are struggling financially at the moment. So please make contact with us. If there is any barriers to getting support, we can see how we can make that accessible to you. We also work, of course, with private health, National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is incredible. We have clients who have chosen to have integration therapists support them as part of their registered NDIS plan, which is historic. And other forms of private payment if you prefer not to be part of a system in the integration support, or just as for therapy, you can pay privately. That is also an option. Next slide. So our therapists are trained in a whole range of modalities, and to be part of this team, you do have to have extensive experience and really be across a range of modalities to be able to work with this level of depth and complexity. So we specialise in integration knowledge, harm minimisation, transpersonal psychology, CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, EMDR, Jungian therapy, and integrative approaches. So it's really trying to merge the Western biomedical scientific model with the spiritual and esoteric models, and really working from a person-centered approach, whatever you need to support your mental health. Next slide. Okay. So as mentioned, yes, we can help to determine if you are potentially eligible to apply for SASB. Although psychiatrists ultimately have the say when it comes to submitting a SASB application, psychiatrists and GPs, we can help you in those initial stages to see if your history, if your evidence is strong enough to then keep proceeding with those processes. We can review your current symptoms, your diagnosis, and your documentation via consultations. We can link you in with other providers in the community while you wait, to provide a holding space, because for many people it is very distressing waiting for these medicines that should be available now, but we will do our best to hold that distress and provide as much connection and support as we can. And we do that through resources, through the groups, through supporting you and helping you self-advocate through your networks, so that you feel empowered to go to your doctor, your specialists, and tell them and ask them for support, because we need it to come from all angles, from research, from therapists, but also from you, from your self-advocacy. We are working with GPs as well, so GPs can submit SASB applications on your behalf, but you will still need a psychiatrist who is at least willing to support your medical history and your diagnosis, and confirm that there isn't any exclusion criteria such as psychosis occurring. So if you have a GP that is supportive, please make contact with me or our team, and we can collaborate with them and work on getting a team to support you for this process. And as mentioned, if you're not eligible for SASB, which many people that contact us at this stage, as we're early in the process of getting these medicines in Australia, there'll be many people that aren't eligible at the moment, and we can link you in with a whole range of psychosocial, cultural, spiritual supports, and also discuss legal treatment centres overseas when borders open up, and the most ethical, safe and professional services that are available and legal. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so just briefly, the integration is a massive topic, but we really value our team's ability to safely explore spiritual crisis, to be able to work with people without fear of necessarily being diagnosed or labelled, and to be able to balance the mystical and transformative experiences within a medical framework if needed. We're able to risk assess and work with you to stay as safe as possible, and support you to unpack cultural conditioning, cultural norms, values, potential trauma that you've had when you've navigated the mental health system, as many people go into the mental health system and come out with additional trauma because of side effects, treatments, and the stigma that exists. So I guess our team is here to help you navigate all of that and address the psychosocial, cultural and spiritual elements that we all have. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you, Alana. So we'll move on, and we'll just quickly finish the rest of the slides and then do Q&A, Alana. I think that might be the best solution here. You right with that, Alana? The chat's disabled. Thank you for telling us that. Could we enable the chat again? We generally disable the chat during the presentation and then we re-enable it. So thank you for that, Sam. Is the chat re-enabled now, Ilan? Thank you. Ilan, we'll just do the rest of the slides now if we could. Thank you. So moving on to the next slide. Thank you, Alana, for that wonderful presentation. Moving on to the next slide, please, Ilan. Is it stuck?
It's on psych support services.
I know, but we just discussed psych support services.
There we go.
Okay, so now we're moving on to this wonderful quote of Tim Ferriss, who says, "I view the next 5 years as an absolutely golden window. It's a wonderful opportunity to invest small amounts of money to have billions of dollars of impact in terms of helping people with mental illness." So we encourage each of you to give what you can. We're a registered charity. We can't do this alone. And we urge you to support Mind Medicine Australia. And we guarantee that we'll put our hearts and souls into making these medicines available to as many people as possible, as soon as possible. Next slide, thank you. So how you can help: start conversations, share, the information in our webinars with others, volunteer. We've got so many volunteers, but also, join our chapters. We have all these chapters around Australia. If there's not one where you are, then please feel free to reach out and we'll help you start one. Obviously, talking to doctors and medical professionals so that we get them up the curve is extremely important. I always say this is a crusade of one doctor at a time, one MP at a time. It's just a hard slog. Just making sure that people really understand the science behind these medicines. You can also set up your own fundraising events. It might be that you have kids at a school and they're having a fundraiser for the day, and they might want to name this is a charity of choice. There's all sorts of things you can do. Follow us on social media, share posts, talk to your local MPs, of course, and attend our webinars. We've got some amazing new webinars coming up, and also Ilan, that slide still says 2020 Summit, but it should say 2021. Next slide, please. So this is the certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies, which I mentioned earlier, and we'd certainly be open to answer any questions that you have about that. As I mentioned, there's only a few places left, and Alana, I think Renee might be on the call, can answer questions about that. And then we have the next slide, which is the summit. Not the right slide either, but this is some of the people who are coming to the summit, and we welcome you to join us at the summit next year and the introductory workshop. And the next slide. So this is the rescheduling slide. Please get on those submissions that Peter encouraged you to. And then the next slide is the upcoming webinars. So as you'll see, we have a whole series of webinars coming up. A really interesting one on the 23rd of September with Dr. Anna Rubinstein on psychedelic therapy as a rite of passage from mental illness to mental health. He's an incredible facilitator. Wednesday, the 14th of October, interesting one with Robert Whitaker from the US, doing more harm than good. Some of the reasons why psychiatric medications aren't working and why we need new treatments. 21st of October, Tripping to Enlightenment, Consciousness, Religion, Mental Health, and so on. We have a lot in October because it's Mental Health Month, so we're doing sort of a double amount. Busting Psychedelic Myths, a wonderful one with Kyle and Joe from Psychedelics Today, again from the US. And then a conversation between part two, with much requested conversation, part two between a psychologist and psychiatrist on trauma and addiction. So we have some really interesting webinars coming up. We'll also have some more webinars in November as well, so watch this space. Okay, so we'll now go to the chat and the questions. Do you mind just passing my computer, Peter, and I'll look at the questions? Thank you. We'll just go straight to the chat screen now. Well, there's a lot of questions here. Just trying to, how do I scroll down, Peter, on here? Can you make that full screen or something? I'm not sure how to go down or up. Oh, there's a line. Let's just go up a little. Alana, is there any questions there that you can quickly identify while I'm...
Yeah, so
sidebar working.
as far as the treatment course goes, would MMA be offering the actual psychedelic assisted sessions if someone gets SASB approval? So we are offering the certificate in psychedelic therapies, and once people complete that course and have the necessary structures in place to provide these therapies, anyone who completes that course will be able to do that with a psychiatrist and medical professional team. And of course, we will have access to a lot of these therapists who will be part of our psych services team. And yes, I will also be doing that work and being mentored by Renee, and will be providing those services as soon as I can.
Thank you for that, Alana. We might go to this question going down slightly. Okay, hold on. Alana, this one might be for you as well. Please discuss how cognitive therapies will be used to facilitate this treatment, given cognitive approaches are considered contraindicative to PTSD. Alternatively, best practice shows that psychedelic-assisted therapy are best facilitated using body and emotionally focused approaches. How will MMA advocate for MHSW? Do you know what that? Oh, mental health.
Social.
Yep. Psychologists provide body and emotionally based psychotherapy, not currently a recognised short-term strategy with an item number under the BH scheme by Medicare.
Well, I guess firstly, it's important to take note that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is the therapy sessions combined with the medicines. So in the certificate of psychedelic therapy course that Renee is designing, therapists will bring their modalities that they're trained in, whether that's CBT, EMDR, somatic experiencing, a whole range of different modalities to their toolkit. They'll bring that to the sessions. Yeah. And you're right, traditional CBT is not conducive in that psychedelic experience. However, CBT can be very helpful in the preparation and integration, some components of it. So the course will train therapists to draw upon their modalities within the evidence base that has been produced by the standards that are occurring from CIIS and different institutions from around the world.
Thanks for that, Alana. So we're going to try and there's so many questions here. These are a couple of the pre-submitted questions. This is sort of an observation, but it's from someone in rural New South Wales, I think, about psychiatrists flying in and flying out, and they'd love to see MDMA psilocybin available to those in rural communities traumatised by bushfires, COVID, depressed, anxious, etc. It's not a question for you, Alana, but it would be great for this medicine to be accessible through bulk billed, publicly funded health services rather than managed by yet another NGO with onerous and prescriptive referral criteria. Another area of need is lonely, depressed elderly who find themselves in aged care facilities, especially since COVID restrictions came in, not eligible to access mental health care plans unless they can privately fund counselling. Question I think here is, are depressed people in rural and regional areas able to access the trials in Melbourne, or how are we going to help those people in rural and regional areas? Peter, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, look, just the first thing is that as these medicines become available through the medical system, they won't be controlled by a not-for-profit organisation, they'll be controlled by the medical system. And Mind Medicine is not trying to interfere with the relationship between medical practitioners, health workers and their patients. We're just trying to make sure that these treatments are available. The second point, and it's a really good one, one of our objectives is to make these therapists available to all Australians. So of course we have to think about rural areas. And the sort of things we are thinking about is, the feasibility of actually sending it. Well, firstly, it may well be possible for the psychiatrist to make the assessment of the patient through telehealth. So that part gets done at a distance, and then subsequently actually flying in the therapists to the regional area to actually conduct the therapy. We're really keen to see this happen, and it's one of the things that we've got on the list to discuss with governments around Australia to make it workable.
Here's another one for you, I think, Peter. I don't think we've answered this one, but it's also, given the issues with the TGA, significant issues regarding access, regarding the regulation of CBD, how do you see the TGA managing MDMA and psilocybin? You sort of answered that in the presentation,
yeah,
haven't you?
So far, touch wood,
Yeah.
we found the TGA really good to deal with, very professional, very thoughtful, and they've done everything that we could expect from them in terms of making SASB approvals available to medical practitioners for these therapies. The problem is not at the moment at the federal level, it's at the state levels.
Alana, this is one for you. Again, pre-submitted question. Daughter was diagnosed with ASD when she was 14. She has high social phobia, anxiety, high level of OCD. She spends most of her time in her darkened room, and her life is very much online, where she's met all her friends. Very sad. Her occupational therapist has assessed she will need years of work on her sensory issues, light, sound, touch, feel, etc. I think her parents are wondering what the possibility of controlled psychotropic therapy might be, like for someone like her daughter who has this sort of mix of conditions. And I know there is a lot of research starting to emerge around, certainly, anxiety, these sorts of disorders, and certainly obsessive compulsive disorder. Did you have any comment to make? She's obviously older than 14 now.
Yeah, I guess the reality is the current initial focus is on psilocybin for depression and PTSD for MDMA. And as this unfolds throughout Australia, so will the clinical trials and research, and we anticipate the criteria to potentially open. I would suggest that, people who do have autism and anxiety and OCDs are potentially eligible for CBD and THC oil as an initial start. So I would suggest considering the research around that and consulting with an expert, and making contact and just getting education information and seeing how the research space unfolds.
So we'd encourage these lovely parents to reach out to us and psych services. Peter, question here for you. S9s can be prescribed in WA with a permit under the Poisons Act like Victoria. However, as a psychiatrist working in WA, I'm concerned that my current professional indemnity cover would not cover me prescribing MDMA or any other experimental treatments. Is this your understanding? And if so, how can Mind Medicine Australia help psychiatrists sort out the required professional indemnity cover to engage in this treatment?
Yeah, well, that's an important issue, and one of the things we've been talking about is the importance of second opinions. I mean, in terms of cover, what you want to know is that what you're doing is supported by your peers. And one of the ways of doing that is obviously to get peer support as part of the process. In terms of medical indemnity, that's something to be taken up directly with the insurer. But I think you'll find that if we have a regimen of second opinions, that will make them much more comfortable.
And Steve, the psychiatrist in WA, if I can encourage you, Erin, if you could send Steve our contact details. He sent in his message at 8:19. Steve, if you can reach out to us, we have a psychiatry circle as well, so that we could provide some other psychiatrists who would be very on board and support you. You may want to talk with them. We also have a Perth Mind Medicine Australia chapter, so we'd be, I don't know if you're in Perth or somewhere else in Western Australia, but we'd certainly be very happy to talk with you further. There's a question here, Alana, I think you might be able to answer this one. My clients mostly have NDIA managed plans. Would they have to have self-managed plans to access your services? Do you know about that, Alana?
Yeah, so I currently see people under both. So it depends on the subcontractor on our team and what they're licensed for. But for example, it is possible to do both. And
I thought you'd already answered that in the chat screen. Sorry, Alana. For patients on medications for PTSD, among other things, has there been any adverse side effects noted so far by using psilocybin or MDMA? Well, look, one of the things that we have on our website is we have a number of documents in a on a link called Important Resources in our Learn section, and I'll get Erin to put that up on the chat screen. And in there, there's a chart which explains how long you need to go off certain antidepressants or other psychiatric medicines before you undertake some of these medicines. I think in the case of MDMA, I'm not sure that there is that necessity, but in the case of psilocybin, it's better to have at least a 2-week, and some people say 4-week break, because your receptors have been dulled by some of the antidepressants and other medications. So we do have some really interesting documents on this on our website, and we urge you to go to that particular section of the website.
And just to jump in there, Tanya, sorry.
Pardon, Ilana?
Just with anything to do with medical, advice and psychedelics, we have GPs who are, trained who can consult on this individual, because it's very nuanced and it's very personal, your medical profile. So if you have any of those questions, we can refer you to people who have those expertise.
Alana, we have a question here. If someone has successfully submitted an SASB, would you take them through the therapy? So we've talked about this, Alana. Would you like to just answer that?
Yeah, it depends on a whole range of factors. I guess as this situation unfolds, it's really important that you find the best care team for you, and there would be, a proper assessment process in that, and building rapport and trust and engagement. So it will be dependent on state. It will be dependent on your preference and the skill set of the person you want to work with.
Thank you. Question here, I'm registered for the CPAT therapist course in January. As a rural generalist doctor in a regional area, would I be able to prescribe and administer psilocybin to eligible patients, or is it only specialist, Peter, I'll get you to answer this one, specialist psychiatrists are able to access it now? I'm thinking about my palliative care patients as well as depression and anxiety. Great question.
So what is the qualifications of this person?
This is a rural generalist doctor, so there probably is not a lot of psychiatrists where he is, and we've talked, a lot about this.
Like in terms of SASB, the only applications that have been made to date, which have been successful, have been made by psychiatrists.
That's not true. There's been one through
I'm coming to that.
Yeah, in rural areas.
Made by psychiatrists or general practitioners with the support of a psychiatrist. Now, whether it can be broadened, that's not been tested. So I don't know the answer to that. I think in the early days of these medicines, we need to be as cautious as possible in terms of the expertise that's assessing the patient and the appropriateness of these therapies for the patient.
But you have suggested that in the submissions that people who are physicians and other doctors do. Yeah. Do you want to just reiterate that point?
Well, it's really important. We could be accused of being too conservative in our submission. And that was just a strategic call, because we thought that the best chance we had to reschedule these medicines was by being a bit conservative in our approach. Those of you who believe we're being too conservative, we would love you to go in and make submissions and say that we're being too conservative, and put in what you think would be the appropriate control structure for these medicines. And the reason I say that is that it's important, I think, for the TJ advisory panel to realise that actually we are being a bit conservative in our submission, and that there are other views out there who think that actually a broader approach would be a more realistic and reasonable approach.
Another question too is, we've had a question here on ADHD and some modelling from Deloitte on the costs of ADHD, which is obviously an enormous cost to the economy, and of course it causes a terrible amount of suffering. Do we know if any trials have been undertaken in the use of psychedelics with ADHD? I don't know if they have yet, but that would be a very interesting study to look at. You might want that on the list. And could psychedelic-assisted therapy for individuals with ADHD be a space worth investigating? And the answer would be yes to that.
Just on that, one of the things about these medicines is if we can demonstrate in real life that is outside of a trial, that these medicines can help people with treatment-resistant depression and treatment-resistant PTSD, and that they can be used safely. As people in the medical world get more and more comfortable about the use of these medicines, inevitably what we're going to see is them being used for a broader range of mental illnesses. But it's sort of one step at a time.
I'm going to try and race through these super fast now because there's so many. Would it be possible to contact the psychiatrists in Victoria who've been granted approval to use these medicines? As a psychiatrist in Queensland, I'm really interested in how they are administering time and cost environment. It'd be great to learn. Andrew Roberts in Queensland, if you could reach out to us and we will help you connect to some of the psychiatrists, probably in New South Wales, because we've had a number of approvals in New South Wales. And we are looking for psychiatrists in Queensland who can be, you know, part of this whole treatment protocol. So we'd be grateful if you could reach out to us, Andrew. Do you want to just write Andrew's name down, Pedro? Just send us your email, Andrew, and contacts, and we'll be happy to speak to you. What is the purpose of the second submission period in the rescheduling, and what will be required of people who made the initial submissions then?
I think what it is it's the TGA giving, really testing the interim decision to make sure that they've got it right. So I suspect once they've made an interim decision, it's going to take a huge amount of argument to convince them that the interim decision is wrong. That's why it's so important that we get the best submissions in during this period. You know, once they've made an interim decision, it's going to take an extraordinary argument to say to them they got it wrong. So really important that we use this first submission period as well as possible.
Yeah. And sorry for those of you, Dr. L was not able to do tonight after all, so we apologise that he's not here, and which is why we have the wonderful Alana and others involved as well. So we hope that we're covering off your questions. What about DVA? Is that covered? So yes, we are talking with DVA. We met with the Minister, Minister Chester last week, who's the Minister for that area. And certainly DVA is starting to look more seriously at this whole area and have been interested in it since we've been speaking with them for the last year and a half or so. In terms of individuals involved in an individual obtaining SASB, I think if that means a patient, the actual applications have to be submitted by psychiatrists or consulting physicians or other doctors, not by individuals. But if you're an individual seeking SASB access, then you need to find a doctor or psychiatrist who's prepared to assist you with that, and we can, in some cases, assist you with that.
Yeah, and you also need to demonstrate that you've tried other modalities and they haven't worked, and you have a serious illness.
Michael Pittard, I'm not sure which question it was, but hopefully I covered it off because I believe I've put out all the pre-submitted questions. DVA, another question here on DVA. Yes, if these medicines become accepted by the DVA as a valid treatment for veterans, then I'm pretty sure that they're going to help cover the costs, and they've given us some indications to that effect. I mean, I think it's very important, if any of you are veterans out there, that you do contact the department and say how important it is for you to have access to these sorts of treatments, because that will work effectively so that they understand the need, and they'll start to see just what a demand there is in veterans in Australia for these treatments. Will it be possible for New South Wales-based patients to be treated over the border in Victoria, or will it be likely to be for permanent Vic residents only? So we went through this.
We went through that because we had a New South Wales doctor, and it was made very clear to us by the Health Department of Victoria that both the doctor and the patient had to be resident in Victoria in order to get the local state permit, which is needed in addition to the SASB approval.
How and where, or could Big Pharma have any influence on the rescheduling? Thanks.
Well, we're going to see, aren't we, in terms of the submissions.
Hopefully they'll be really supportive.
That are made, but there's been no evidence so far of Big Pharma being disruptive. But you know, we're keeping a watch out, because clearly we want to make sure that these applications are dealt with on their merits, and we have every reason to believe they will be dealt with on their merits.
Alana, here's an important one for you. If only psychiatrists and medical practitioners can, no, so we're not saying that only psychiatrists and medical practitioners can administer these medicines. What we're saying is that only psychiatrists and certain medical practitioners can actually prescribe through the SASB and be prescribers. However, the medicines can absolutely be, the treatment with these medicines will be conducted largely by psychologists and psychotherapists. Alana, do you want to, and social workers and others, do you want to clarify that?
Yeah, so if you look at the Certificate in Psychedelic Therapies web page on the Mind Medicine website, you'll see that who's eligible to apply for the course, and that is who, you know, we want in the room, and that's guided by what's happening in MAPS and around the world. So this is bringing in psychotherapists, psychologists, mental health social workers, mental health nurses, who have, you know, the skills and personal qualities to be able to guide and work with medicines. But the prescribers will be psychiatrists, potentially GPs.
Thanks for that. Important to clarify that, isn't it? Just let me go up again.
There was a, can I answer this one?
Go for it, Alana, please.
So Sean wrote, I know in the shamanic settings, the practitioner would take the medicine with the participant. Will this happen here in Australia? You know, no, it won't. But I guess what we can say is similar to MAPS, what we aim in the Certificate in Psychedelic Therapies course down the track when this is approved is part of the trial of the therapist training is that the therapist actually experiences the dose of, particularly of MDMA, and this is what happens at MAPS in their legal clinical protocols, so that the therapist has those transformative experiences themselves. And we'll also be doing holotropic breath work and bringing in people into our psych services team who have, have the.
You talked about the MDMA. Did she just say that?
She talked about taking the MDMA, so the therapist could actually understand.
Yes, yeah.
Part of a clinical process.
Alana, quick one for you, just a quick one because there's so many more here. Is there evidence for which substances may be used as part of PAP to treat complex developmental PTSD? I mean, obviously that would be MDMA, but it's developmental. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, it's complex. It depends with developmental trauma if there's you know other factors. So yeah, you can contact us directly if you want to drill down further into that personally.
Yeah. Are there any just on the TGA submission form, page 5, there is a multiple choice question asking what state you are working in. Queensland is the only state not listed. That's weird. Okay, it must be a typo, but needs to be addressed.
Well, thank you for that. We'll look into that.
Ilan, could you note that, please, Ilan?
Yes, I have, and I've asked if we can please have a copy of that link, and then we can notify the TGA.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a TGA mistake by the sounds of it.
Yeah. Would the condition functional neurological disorder with underlying anxiety and non-epileptic seizures be a potential condition for this treatment?
The pathway at the moment is major depression for psilocybin and trauma, complex trauma for PTSD for MDMA, and if there's additional factors that will need to be assessed by the psychiatrist.
Okay. Here's again a question. Do you have to stop taking SNRIs prior to undertaking? So again, there's a document about that on the important resources part of our website. Erin, if you could please actually link the important resources, that actual hyperlink for that, that would be really valuable because we're getting a lot of questions like that.
But again,
or Ilan, if you could.
Over and above that document, really important that's discussed with the medical professional.
Yeah. Gable Mache, oh yes, well, Gable Mache writes, oh, thank you, Alana, for that. My friend diagnosed with PTSD dissociation has just received a Section 32 by the court because of MDMA possession while seeking treatment. Would her submission be regarded negatively or useful?
Oh, I think that's actually quite useful because people can try because they can't access this sort of therapy. There is a risk that people go underground because when you've got that sort of mental illness, you sort of desperately want to have it cured. And the fact that you felt the need to do that is something that I think the TGA needs to be aware of in their considerations.
Yes.
It is far better, it's far safer if this is brought into our medical system with all the appropriate controls.
Yes, I mean, to Disco or your friend, I mean, if you could put in a submission or submissions about that, I think it really does illustrate that point. And look, there's another one here, a number of questions, it seems to me, around a psychiatrist in Sydney will be willing to get approval for SASB. That's fantastic. Would it work to go to Victoria for treatment? Alana, just remind me again where we got to with that.
Sorry, I was responding to the chat. I apologise.
No, that's all right. It's just a question from Vanessa. A psychiatrist in Sydney is willing to get SASB approval. Would it work to go to Victoria, for example, to have treatment with yourself and Renee? Or is it only available to Victorian residents? I know we've discussed this and my mind's a bit foggy on this.
The feedback we've had so far from the Victorian government is you've got to be a Victorian resident. Now, we haven't pushed that, so...
you never know. I mean, look, I think for those of you that are in Sydney, this is a really stupid law that's in New South Wales. It's an overreach and it has unintended consequences. So one of our suggestions is to write to the Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, and start just saying this is not fair, and why should Victoria and other states have access to these medicines while we don't? So you need to start talking to your politicians. Really, this is the only thing that we can suggest so that these medicines become available to you as soon as possible, because there's so many people out there who are suffering. Okay. Let's just see. How can our psychiatrist... Okay. Again, more questions about psychiatrists in Sydney. Again, if they reach out to us, my email's Tanya, Tania, at mindmedicineaustralia.org. Please send us a note. Any psychiatrist will help connect you, join the dots. Is there ever a possibility of growing the medicines in Australia for medical use? So yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we're looking at, both growing and manufacturing of these medicines in Australia, so that we don't have to spend as much and it's very onerous to bring these medicines into Australia. So the goal is to create an industry in Australia to make sure that these medicines can be available more simply and more easily, and they're locally produced. And, after all, fully Australian made is good, right? What are your thoughts on synthetic psilocybin? I'm sure there are people who are reluctant to take synthetic psilocybin, etc. Will there potential? Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, look, at this stage of the process with the TGA, synthetic psilocybin is the only thing they're going to look at. There haven't been any trials, to my knowledge, on using psilocybin from mushrooms. And to the extent that we go down that track in the future, there are going to have to be a whole range of protocols developed to ensure standardization and so forth. Now, there is a potential trial that we're hopefully going to be involved with looking at that, but that's going to be some years away. In the early years of this, it's going to be the synthetic product.
Yeah.
And some of us may not, would prefer, may prefer the natural product, but, we're dealing in the medical world now. And in the medical world, it's all about standardization and comfort with that the product has the exact molecules that it's supposed to have.
Another one here. I believe there is current trials going on for obsessive compulsive disorder. Is it Imperial or Johns Hopkins? I can't remember.
There is, and it'll be on our website.
It'll be on our website, Andrew. Let's see. Okay. Okay. All right, everyone. Please, firstly, thank you. I want to thank Peter. I want to thank Alana for their wonderful input today. And I want to thank all of you for coming on this call. Amazing amount of, I think quite a large amount of people. There were a lot more before, but we will, for those of you who know people who've registered, this will go online and people will be able to watch replays, so please share those. And next time, can we encourage each of you to please bring at least 2 people along to our next webinars, and and register for them so that we keep growing this community and educating more people. That's what it's really going to take, everyone. There's a great community here of people and many familiar faces who are supporting and really starting to, we're all learning a lot from these webinars. I've got to say they're fantastic. But if you can bring more people, more doctors, more MPs, more lawmakers, and just generally the general public along, that will be fantastic. And thank you. Thank you all again.
And as I say, please put in those submissions.
Oh, yes. There's only 2 weeks, right?
Only 2 weeks left. And if you're not a doctor or a medical person or a researcher, find yourself a doctor or a medical person or a researcher and get them to put in a submission, because it's really important that we get as much support behind this as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And we'll send a thank you note tomorrow with a whole lot of links and other stuff. So we'll keep communicating and look forward to hearing from you very soon again. Thank you all. Thanks so much. Have a good evening or day if you're in another part of the world. Bye, everyone.